Hey, family, welcome once again to this space, this place I love to call our own kind of space where we get to talk about the stuff we want to talk about with the people we want to talk to. Ain't that something? That's a blessing right there. You can be caught up in all kinds of conversations and don't want to be really. Have you ever been in a space where you didn't really want to be and you didn't want to be talking, you want to be relating? Well, that ain't this space. This space is a space we call Relevant Conversation with yours truly, John Selders. That's me. And I get to talk to some of the brightest, the smartest, the most compassionate, caring, active in ministry and in public witness that I can find. And we get to talk about the stuff I want to talk about. And I hope and I pray the things that we are sharing are relevant to you as well. Let's just get to it. Let's get right at it. I am happy once again to bring on to our platform somebody who is no stranger to us in some ways, and knew of him and his reputation for a long time. And then we had the off chance, I'll call it that. Some might say the Lord ordered our steps, right? Providence brought us together. We were out in the cornfields in Illinois at this meeting. And somebody had said to me, you ought to meet. And we bumped into each other, literally. I mean, almost serendipitously so, and of course became fast friends at that point, and have shared. That was a quarter century ago now, just about nearabouts. Didn't know he had connections to the place I would end up in. That's here, and we've been brothers and family, and have journeyed together across a number of different landscapes. And a number of different settings in the work of ministry. Now, I gotta make sure I get some of the facts right. He went to the school down the street from me. You know, I spent a little time at that school. Some of y'all may know it. It's Yale. Yeah, he went down to the school down the street and got a couple of degrees down there. Got some paper, and then went from there to Louisville, where he spent some time teaching and in ministry there. In fact, pastored the church there and in ministry in Louisville. Went to Philadelphia from Louisville, and was there teaching, and we bumped into each other there. Now that was, I can't say we bumped into each other. That was a setup. We knew each other was there, and we were doing some work and working with some of the same folk. And then all of a sudden he ends up in Chicago, where I used to be. In fact, We spent time in the northern part of Chicago, and then came down south. So sorry, and ultimately, here's where I'm landing. He became the 13th president of Chicago Theological School there, and then has done some other stuff. He now serves as he's a visiting professor, a wandering professor. It's much like the wandering bishop's role that some of us have had, Steve. And now has come back. I would say literally home, and he's now the senior pastor of Center Church, not Center Church. I better get this right. Church on the Green. Because if you say Center Church, there's two different churches in New Haven. There's two different churches, and folk will correct me if I don't get this right. But he's serving now as the senior minister there in New Haven, and is a dear brother and friend of mine. Could you welcome to this platform the Reverend Dr. Stephen Ray? Let me bring him on. Hey, bro.
Hey, John. Good to see you, my brother. Good to be here.
I appreciate it very much. We got a lot to talk about. This weekend just came in through here and went. And before we get there, I wonder if you would say a word about your journey to this place. You're newly installed, shall we say? That's the language we use in the tradition that we both serve in this current work. But talk to us a little bit about your trajectory from the pastorate into the academy, and of course becoming leading Chicago Theological. That ain't bad stuff right there. But then leaving that to continue teaching, but also come back into the pastorate. Talk a little bit about that journey, if you will.
Well, once again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. When I went to seminary to begin with, it was because I thought that my career was going to be in the pastorate. And it wasn't until I was in my second year of seminary that really the idea and the calling of being a professor, scholar, and theologian came to me. So while I was working on my PhD, I was also pastoring a couple of churches, the Black Church at Yale, and then the Mighty Fellowship Community Church. So I was pastoring those two churches. That second one, you know very well. And when I went to Louisville, is when I really made the choice that I was going to focus, because I was pastoring there as well. But for me, it's never been an either or proposition. For me, it was always what is going to be the emphasis in my life at this point in time. So I pastored in Louisville for 3.5 years. And that was at the beginning of, as the old folk would say, the arts. That was at the beginning of the arts. And I had always known that when my career came to an end, that I had a sense that I wanted to close it out in the pastorate. So I didn't want to wait until I only had a few years left. And this opportunity came along because when I left Chicago Theological Seminary, to be honest with you, carrying an institution through COVID was a very difficult thing. So I was happy to hand that to someone else. And I was also happy to hand the vocation of being an administrator to someone else, because I didn't want the weight of an institution on my shoulders. I had done it long enough. So then I did a visiting professorship, and the Lord brought me to back to Connecticut. And so in a way, this was where I always thought it would end at, not necessarily in Connecticut, but back in the pastorate, because I always described myself and my work is that I'm a preacher by calling. I just happen to be a theologian by trade.
Thank you, because in many ways, a number of us carry, I would call, the weight and call, if you will, of both being, of letters and of learning, not necessarily letters of the institution. Some of us carry some letters by way of the work and bearing in our body the marks of the Lord Jesus, if you will.
Mhm.
If you let me be churchy just for a minute. Um, and yet also understand that the work of ministry is beyond, the four walls of the academy,
Right.
and is without the four walls of the church and the pulpit. So
Mhm.
that and that married, very few of us actually understand the marrying of the two. Yet, so let me say it differently. I think while we may understand it, get the opportunity to live it out,
Mhm.
right? And so thank you for sharing your journey in short. Of course, this I'm like Jesus. When the disciples asked Jesus, and he had performed some miracle, and they said, "Boy, how did you do that?" He said, "Wait a minute. These things don't come. These things come by fasting and praying. Now you just can't jump up and do some of this." So I recognize
Mhm.
as well that you didn't just jump from this place to that place and back to this place without some fasting and some praying,
Mhm.
and some
Mhm.
discerning as to, is this the time? Is this the right moment? Is this where we need to share? And it also is the coming of times. Sometimes you know we've been called to a place for such a time as this.
Right. Right.
You know,
Mhm.
as the scriptures would have it. And we were sharing before we went on live tonight that there is a moment, and I've been grappling with every guest over the last few sessions around what it means to be in this moment. Academically speaking, there is a conjunctural analysis. That language comes to us by Antonio Gramsci, and then later on Stuart Hall picks it up and begins to speak of when we're in a particular moment. That there are things that we can look at that then says, yes, we're in this particular moment. And now I'm gonna get churchy with it. I'm gonna get very theological, if you will, and allow me to say that for us, we've had people who herald those moments, whose coming announce that moment. That's for us in the Christian context. That's John the Baptist saying,
Mhm.
"Yeah, I'm here, and I do baptize you with water, but there's one coming that would baptize you with the Spirit." Right? He was foretelling of, in his role as the heralder of the one to come after. That would have been Jesus, and so we have these opportunities and this contexting for us to venture into, and I have in some way theologically and spiritually been thinking of what is the role then of those of us who are in religious space, those of us who are in spirit space, and what is our role as a prophet to speak to not only our communities, meaning our faith communities, whether that's the church, the mosque, the synagogue, or the temple. What is our role as prophet, as engaging the community in a larger way? How do we become prophets? How do we own the role, and what does it look like for a modern day prophet? Who are the Jeremiahs? Who are those who are crying in the wilderness, or better yet, in the halls of power, like Nathan did for David.
Mhm.
You know, and then maybe we referenced maybe Eli to to Samuel, right? Anyway, it, what what's this moment? And then of course, let's couple it with let me pause there and have you respond to that, if you will.
Well, I think one of the things that is not often enough observed about the prophets is that the prophets usually begin not by saying that you have forgotten God, although they often said that. Not saying that you've lost your way, they often said that. They begin with you have forgotten where you came from, right? And because you have forgotten where you came from, you find yourself in a position that you are not equipped to deal with the situation in which you find yourself as a people, in the situation in which you find yourself in the midst of those who are arrayed against you. Um, and because you are not prepared, what ends up happening is that there's certainly the motif of being carried away into exile, of being destroyed, or what have you. But one of the most powerful motifs is that you lose yourself in this larger and greater society. And once you lose yourself, once you begin to answer the call of other gods and what have you, what you end up finding is that those places hold nothing but peril and destruction for you, but you have forgotten where you came from, so you have no idea where to go. So I wanted to lift that up because one of the things I wanted to talk about this evening is that when we talk about the moment that we're in, and when we talk about what is it that is sort of brewing, what we need to remember are two things, and I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but it's important for us to remember that there was a period in the 19th century, starting in 1867, all the way until 1896, in which it was the period of Reconstruction and immediately following, in which Black people, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the moment, Black people had the first fruits of freedom. Recall the Reconstruction legislatures that existed in the 1860s and 1870s were full of Black legislators. They were full of people who were functionaries like postmasters, which was an important job at that time. And so it seemed as if we had finally turned the corner. And in thinking that we finally turned the corner, there was a way in which once the sort of backlash came with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, and that's the moment that I want to say we're in now, is that when a political solution was met that distanced itself from what the electoral reality was, that set in motion the demise of Reconstruction. And finally, you get to 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson, in which case the separate but equal, which became the bedrock of Jim and Jane Crow, was instilled throughout all of America's public life. Now, I want to go back to that point because I think that one of the things that we have not said often enough is that when people say, well, America will always choose democracy, America will not choose dictatorship, America will not choose a fascist government, that's not true at all. That's what Jim Crow was. Jim Crow was a racial dictatorship. Jim Crow was racial fascism. And we lived under that reign for almost 80 years. Now, part of what I want us to notice is that if we look at the recent decisions by the Supreme Court, they are every bit as pernicious as those that brought about the first Jim Crow. So, one of the things I think as we're looking at this particular moment is that we are very much in a space in which the open question is whether or not Reconstruction 2.0, which was what the civil rights movement was, is going to be finally snuffed out in the same way Reconstruction 1.0 was. Now, I want to lift that up as a faith reality because what ends up happening is that that is then the primary challenge within which faith communities have to step, because we are the ones who are going to have to deal with communities that are innovated in terms of resources. We're the ones that are going to have to deal with educational systems in the midst of this investment. We are the ones that are going to have to deal with situations in which economic opportunity begins to shrivel up, and in which this sort of reality of America's residential segregation takes hold once again, so that opportunities are created that are out of reach. And historically, the Black church and other churches as well have been the ones that have had to step into the breach. So I say all of that to say that we are at a moment now in which it is being decided whether or not we are at the end of Reconstruction 2.0. And we have to recognize that the church, religious communities, the mosques, the synagogues are the ones who step into the breach when the sort of reality that we've taken for granted begins to dissolve and becomes dismantled.
Yeah, and well, you said a whole lot there, and let's unpack it a little bit. I appreciate you very much referencing the era right after the Civil War and Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, and I'll name it as such. And when you, for me, I think of Robert Smalls in South Carolina, who becomes,
Mhm.
you know, a member of Congress, in
House of
fact, in the United
Representatives,
States
that's
Congress.
right. Mhm.
Or I think about Henry McNeil Turner, an AME bishop in
Mhm.
Georgia, who gains a seat via the election, but then is asked to empty his seat because the white supremacists of Georgia just could not necessarily handle. And he has a very, very powerful address he made for which we source today,
Right.
and so that that faith leaders within the Black communities in particular have always stepped in to provide leadership for the entire community. So I'm appreciative of you referencing that moment, and then the what I would call the epoch that then took on that took shape as we look back on history now, right after Plessy versus Ferguson. You know,
Right.
that Supreme Court decision. You know, separate but equal, right? That then we ended up living into until the 1950s, Brown versus
Mhm.
Board of Education, and that is not just, as you know, Plessy versus Ferguson was about really transportation. It was about public accommodations. And today, many people would say, "Hey, we're talking about education." Well, that wasn't that was one example of what this whole entire culture assumed the position of, and then the emergence of the modern day golden era civil rights movement. So
Right.
that's a whole trajectory. And what I just heard you say is, are we at another epoch moment,
Yes,
right?
that's
You know,
exactly what I'm saying.
Stuart Hall would say that's yeah, we may have versions of what may be an epoch. We may have this moment, not this conjectural moment, through conjectural analysis, would say we're going somewhere different. And I would argue, if you call me to argue, I would argue you're absolutely right. There's something that feels different. That feels and I'm not just saying that in a feeling moment, although I do value what I feel and what I sense. You can also, there's a way, if your spiritual radar is tuned to the right frequencies, you can get some messages. You can hear, you can sense and see, and there are ways in which there's evidentiary stuff there that says we are moving into another space and place. And I also heard, if I'm correct, I heard you say that it is in those times that faith communities step into the breach, right?
Yes.
Step into that what begins to create a void, where the expectations have been, and then we say, okay, they're not being met, and in the middle of that, at least for me, there are people in the midst. And I just recently, through a evaluative piece that I took, one of these tests, it became the result said that I value people,
Mhm.
and I had to say, "Yep, that's true. That's true to me." That in the midst of this, my beloved Pamela often says, at the end of all of our policy making and all of our politicking and all electoral political machinations we do and policy making we do, there are people. And I would have to absolutely agree, and I appreciate her reminding me often that the
Mhm.
work that of ministry, in the public square, has to preference people. There is a preference to the people whose lives are impacted by the work that we do legislatively, politically, policy work that we're engaged in, and yet I want to also say, have we as a community gifted ourselves too much to the political electoral politics and abandon other ways of being in the world? Or is there something new? I keep wanting to reach for. Are there other ways of creating a new heaven and a new earth? If you allow that metaphor of Revelations to be lived out in our conversation, what are the ways in which maybe we may be being called to revisit how we are in community, how we are in relationships to one another, and then how does that then bode to the way in which we behave, the way in which we legislate and govern our lives?
All right, so I mean, what you just raised was some very rich questions. I think in terms of the moment in which we live as a way of thinking about answering those questions, or at least beginning to grapple with those questions, is that um, um, if we lose this political moment, we will have no choice but to revert back to the kinds of religious communities which sustained us during the Jim Crow era, which sustained us during the death of Reconstruction. Uh, um, Benjamin Mays, in his dissertation that became a book, The Negro's God as Evidenced in His Literature, talked about how it was that there was an accommodationist stream that simply seeks to help Black people survive with their dignity, survive with their hope, looking for there being a better season. Now, one of the reasons why that sort of comes back to me is that as we talk about our politics, one of the things that I ask, and a question that I have is the church up to that challenge if it comes as an onslaught against us again? Right. And what I mean by that is that there is a significant and substantial sort of way in which we have become so obsessed with the whole discourse of decline and the whole discourse of sort of saving an institution that we have not tended to creating institutions that can save communities when they are under assault. And the churches that do know how to do that are usually the ones that are held in disrepute by the intelligentsia, right? So, I mean, there's a way in which the storefront church knows how to save people's lives in the thick of the fight. But there's a significant and sort of way that the Silk Stocking Church, which is currently in decline, doesn't have any internal resources because they simply don't know how to survive unless they are in positions of power and privilege. And when they're not in positions of power and privilege, they find themselves shriveling up and going away. So that's, one piece of it. But I think another piece of it is that when you talk about the alternatives that we look at, the piece that came out of the debate, and I know it's a shop-worn thing, but I'm going to bring it up again between Du Bois and between Washington, was that Du Bois said, basically, I don't disagree with you about what Black people need to do in terms of building economic strength and whatnot. Where I disagree with you is that without political power, you have no way to protect what you build. And I think that that's one of the things that we've seen unfolding over and over again. When you look at the communities that we've built, I mean, you look at the communities we built in places like Hartford, in places like New Haven, in places all over. I mean, there were vibrant communities that were built by people with businesses. And they talk about those days, but because we didn't have the political power, once the forces of disinvestment descended upon us, once the forces of sort of rapid underinvestment in our educational systems began to descend on us, we didn't have the power to stop it. And so we used our power to do other things. And at the end of the day, we talk about the way things were. And as it is no more, we're at another one of those moments, right? Because over the last 20 years or so, there's been a renaissance because of very many of the diaspora in Black communities coming in, bringing a new kind of vibrancy, et cetera, and creating different kinds of economic vitality. But we'll find that those as well, if we don't have wise and competent political leadership, will uh, meet the fate that the generation of migrants before them, who happen to come from the South, find themselves in. So I think you're right. We have to look at a new politics. We have to look at how to step into this moment. But I think also we have to be crystal clear about not just our political analysis, but the prescription for being able to concentrate our political power in ways that can stave off what's happening in the Supreme Court, that can stave off what's happening in legislatures all over the country. And that becomes the challenge because, once again, the church is the one that steps into that breach because the other institutions that exist within our community have proven to be ephemeral at best and transitory more commonly.
I hear you, Doc. I hear you. And yet, for me, I think the moment that you referenced a little bit earlier, COVID knocked us out
Mhm.
in a just a matter of a few seconds. It felt like we went from fully accessible to locked down, and the whole, not just the United States economy, the global economy
Mhm.
went into fast free for all, right? In many ways. Okay, that's some kind of large moment, right? What just happened over the weekend? A Allegedly, a software update
Yeah.
caused a global crisis
Yeah.
as it relates to transportation. And I don't know about in I'm in a small kind of insulary setting within the higher education and college campus. Our systems went all kind of crazy for a while there, and I thought, boy, and it wasn't nothing working. I couldn't make no phone calls, couldn't get no emails. What if somebody switched off, went in there and just hit the switch? Cause my phone ain't gonna work. I ain't gonna have no more digital books. I ain't gonna have, all of my,
Mhm.
you know, it makes me think for a moment. We've had these moments where we've had, Cornel West calls it, we've had just catastrophe. We've had just outright catastrophic failure in some of our systems. And I wonder, the question comes, what do we bring that we could steps that brings us into the breach with something that's life-giving, life-informing, life-sparing? And of course, for me, it is then, what is the role of the prophet? that not only names, you're right, not only names what's wrong, but also provides the balm in Gilead, the Saul. It also suggests the way forward, right? So talk a little bit about that, sir.
Well, I mean, if you look at the prophets as well, and when the talk, I mean, what the message of the prophets is that your faith will give you what you need to survive. And on the other side of this, whatever this is, right, whether it's the Babylonians, whether or not it's the Assyrians, whether or not it's the northern kingdom versus the southern kingdom of Judah, right, on the other side of this, because one of the things that at least the way Christians have structured our appropriation of the text in terms of the books that we use from the Hebrew Bible and whatnot is that there is never a final victory. I mean, certainly there is a final victory at some point, but that's in God's hands. But ours is a history of sort of coming together and building societies, cultures, etc., and creating a synthesis that then dissolves. Right. So, I mean, one of the things, if you just read history, is that when you look at each of the empires or epochs of human history, which have fallen, they have fallen very quickly. Right. They haven't gone into decline and taken 200 years to do. I mean, certainly the underpinnings did that. But when the collapse came, the collapse was quick. So, my thought about what the prophet does then is to remind people when this not unexpected thing comes to you, how is your faith in God leading you to build the type of community that you can sustain one another until you get to the other side? Right? Because that's what the whole thing about the Valley of Bones was that it was a metaphor for a people who had not built that kind of community. So what they found themselves was that they were cut off and they were sort of scattered about. And so the word that was brought to them was find a way to knit yourself together again. I mean, one of the things that this weekend should have reminded us, and you and I were talking about this before we got online, is that if a sustained sort of outage comes along, at least here in North America, because of what Zoom has become to us, that will be the death knell for the church. So a 3-week shutdown will not only be the chaos within our society, will not only be the sort of disruption within our society, that will be the death knell of the church because of what we have become in terms of how we order our lives. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong one way or the other, but the question is, are we prepared in that moment, and do we have a thick enough community so that we can hold on until we get to the other side?
Well,
And the prophet is the one that's telling you that's what you need to do.
yes, I hear you. For me, it is then that some of what we bring that I guess we gotta speak to it, right? That we bring relationship, that we bring a sense of community within the context of a broader existence, so that I am known, yes, by title and position, but I'm also known by relationship, so that somebody's gonna call. They don't see me at church. Well, I'm pastor, so if I'm not there a couple of Sundays, somebody gonna. If I miss one Sunday and it's not predestined, it's not already prearranged, somebody gonna run around the
Mhm.
come around and check on brother minister and brother bishop and say, hey, you all right? So I wonder then that there is some I don't know. I'm going to call it, there's some hope, or there's something there to how we bring ourselves to this moment and how we speak to this moment. I'm very mindful of the fact that there are many people who have lost a sense of hope, right?
Mhm.
They see all of the goings on, and Lord have mercy, are there goings on? I mean, we go from one week of an attempt of an assassination of a presidential candidate, to the on the other side of this thing, they said he's too old, so he steps down, and then the possibility of the electing of a black woman to this, at least her ascendancy to the top of the ticket. I mean, those are just two examples. I could talk about this ad nauseum. The wars and rumors of wars we got going on, not just in Gaza or Ukraine, but just across the way in Haiti, that you don't hear anything about these days. We haven't heard about Gaza at all for a minute.
Mhm.
Because we've been preoccupied, of course, with what's been happening here. And yet there is a word from the Lord, I believe. There is, again, I'm talking kind of churchy, y'all. Y'all forgive me for my non-churchy folk. But I believe there is something to be said to those who are the faithful, whether that faithfulness that exists in a public square setting, but also the faithfulness of just minding one's every day, tending to one's family, tending to one's neighborhood, one's community. How might we say in this moment, what is it that we should be hanging on to? What are the touchstones that we should be at least reaching for in this moment?
Well, I think, the first touchstone, when you're talking about what people are looking for, is the very simple one, that even in the midst of all of this, you matter, right? You know what I mean? Because we've talked about that in terms of broad movements and whatnot. But one of the things that certainly sociologists and social psychologists have talked about is the crisis of one, atomization, of people feeling as if they're not meaningfully connected throughout all the spheres of their lives. And so, as a consequence, loneliness, which is a term that means a bunch of different things, is one of the major and significant challenges that's facing us, particularly post COVID. So the whole message of the faith, which is that you matter, and that you matter to something more than the forces that would exploit you, that you matter more than simply the forces that would use you. I mean, that's slave religion, right? Slave religion, and I mean that in a positive way, is the constant reinforcement that no matter what the world makes of you, you matter. And we are here as a community to remind each other that we matter. So, I mean, that's the first piece. And, if it sounds like it's a small thing, I mean, it really does sound like it's a small thing, but it is not a small thing at all when we think about the atomizing tendencies of our society, when we think about the ways in which mobility within our society makes it difficult for people to have sustaining families and relationships that have Sunday dinner every night, right? That you can anchor yourself in, not every night, but every week, that you can anchor yourself in. And I mean, when I go back and look at the grand sweep of scripture, I mean, that's a part of what the language of the prophets was. The prophets were talking to Israel as a people, but it was talking to Israel as a personification of someone whom God was in relationship with, right? The God who was going to be providing hope for the future. So it wasn't, in that regard, something that was only communal, but it was communal in the way that it spoke to people as individuals as well. Now, on the other side of that is that social activism and social and political action that loses sight of the fact that it is because people matter and people are the point. We talked about that as well. Is ultimately activism and political action that will find itself co opted very quickly by the forces against which it says it is fighting. One of the things, and I'm not going to get on this horse for too long, but one of the things that I find most distressing about the events of the last 3 weeks. Certainly, I will provide my full support for Vice President Harris, but it is not lost on me that what brought this moment into being was a political decision that primaries don't matter, that it doesn't matter what happened in the primaries, that the political exigencies of the moment are the only thing that's important. And that was the exact logic of the Hayes Compromise in 1876, right? That ended Reconstruction. That was the exact logic, that primaries don't matter, that votes don't matter when they bump up against political expediency, right? You grew up in Chicago. I grew up in New York. One of the biggest fights that our forebears had in the 60s and 70s were political machines that would say, we don't care what the primary says. These are the political expedient things to do. And so when I talk about we're in this moment, I mean the moment that we're in is a moment in which, while we can rejoice about the elevation of Vice President Harris, it is also one in which we are politically reenacting the death of Reconstruction. When we say that at the end of the day, the votes don't matter, the political expediency of the moment is all that's important. And, if Black folk don't think that's going to get turned back on them, then they haven't been students of their own history.
Well, you said something. You done said a whole lot right there, and quite frankly, we've been having this conversation in the life of my local congregation, and I serve a small but vibrant and passionate group of folk that would call me their pastor. And some of what we've been naming in the course of the conversation, we've been using first the letters of First John as our background. And one of several of the lessons have been around love, right? And there's some very, 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 very deeply famous quotations out of the book of the letter of First John that talk about love. Love is God. God is love, and there's all the those metaphors and images, and that we also have in as we've gone through the text, gone from love of God, love of neighbor, to love of neighbor exemplifies love of God. And
Right.
and the question would come, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Did God love us? That then God's love shed abroad in our hearts, which is part of the text, or do we love God and as an example of God's love coming from within to without, then we exemplify the love of God. And it's been a fascinating, understanding that there may have been several writers over several different times and time zones that I remind, my congregation of, I am that much of a scholar and a nerd to say, hold on, before we start quoting and, throwing down, we might have had a couple of different writers and a couple of different times, and, they may have added to it, taken away before we ever got it in this written form. And certainly they didn't speak in English. So we may have lost some things in translation. We might want to go slower and back up and take a bit broader view of it. But certainly for me, we've been lodging and situating fundamentally our conversation in the bedrock of love, right? Community and love. So if that is the case in all of what you've just named, then we got to, it comes to reason. Then how do we in this moment and circumstance understand ourselves to have been through a couple of battles? This ain't the first rodeo. Use history, take a beat and have a Sankofa moment, if you will. Remember, we've come through many tears, toils, and snares, right? We've come through a couple of things, and understand that now that should at least position us in a certain way that when systems fail, when structures crumble, when organizations come and go, when political parties rise and fall, when we have charismatic leaders, and then when we don't have, one charismatic leader, but we have hundreds of charismatic leaders. I think that was the brilliance of Black Lives Matter, in fact, that there wasn't just one solitary singular leader, but there were many leaders throughout the country and the world, in fact. That gives us the opportunity to pull on that which are our strengths, one of which you've just named is the historical record that we can draw from. We don't necessarily have to make this up, and yet we got to pull into that which we know, both epigenetically, I would name, but also that which we could glean and learn the skills from. Because now we have to make something new. We gotta make some clay, and ain't got no hay. We gotta make brick without all of the stuff. We gotta come up. We gotta engage our ingenuity, right? And I love and make some lemonade and old fashioned lemonade at the restaurant. Could I have some lemon with that water? Take that them packages of sweetener, and they have our own kind of lemonade, if you will. Right. Figure out what makes this work. If you ain't never had a sugar sandwich, God bless you. But I done ate sugar sandwiches before. So with some butter, some light bread, as we called it, and some sugar, and then and did all right until we could get it knocked off the hunger and did all right for a moment. But I'm using that as a metaphor, using that as for example that I think that may come into play, and it may come into play now, because here we are in this moment where you're right. Should it not have been that we remake a decision that's already been made? Well, the fact of the business is, Doc, they done it. It's seemingly inevitable, right? That they're gonna that a whole new thing is gonna be created, right, out of a convenient in a moment. And then what do we say to these things? What do we say to these things?
Well, and I mean, that's part of what I'm trying to do, certainly with my church, is to remind people, and this is particularly important for churches that, like mine, have a very strong social justice history, and it's a part of the DNA, is to remind ourselves that while it is significant and substantial that we bring power and resources to the public square, that's not why we exist, right? We exist so that we bring to the public square a space in which, whether systems function, whether systems collapse, whether systems begin to just slowly dissolve, there is a place that people will be able to come and experience what it is to be beloved of God and one another, and that we're not making a choice, either or. Either you do that or you do the social justice piece. The point is that if you forget that you have to do them both at the same time, and I mean, that's what the genius of King was, right? I mean, because King was a Baptist preacher. If you asked him what he was, He might describe himself on occasion as a civil rights leader, but his point was those two were the things that were held in tension because when you lose either one, then you end up losing what the vocation of the church as the salt of the earth is. And, in moments like we're in now, in which society is seemingly on the brink, when it seems like the society that we've known is sort of becoming something that folk don't want to imagine it could be, you have to have some anchors. And one of the anchors is, of course, the political and civil religion. But at the end of the day, I don't know that that has the power to sustain people over the long haul. And I think one of the things about the growth of the nuns and all of that group is that their presence is a judgment on the religious communities because in the times through which they've come, we have not been able to give them what they need. My daughter often talks about, and I'm going to stop. My daughter often talks about how people my age, and I'm in my early 60s, have no idea what it meant for a child in middle school to experience 9/11 and spend their entire adolescence in a society that was trying to process that trauma, but processing it in ways that was destroying the rest of the world. And so when we talk about the nuns are the judgment that in the moment when they needed us to be able to do something, we were so concerned about church decline that we weren't being for them what they needed for us to be. And now we're upset because they went and found some things that were what they needed them to be. Sunday brunch with their friends, being able to go and enjoy public life in parks, all of the ways in which they found what they needed to keep their sanity. And somehow we think that they're the ones who are wrong.
I appreciate you saying that. You just reminded me of Dr. King's drum major's instinct. It was the sermon he preached in '68, not long before. In fact, was it the last sermon or it was close to it?
It was exactly a year before. So he preached it in 1967 on April 4th, 1967.
So he talks about this, the instinct, the desire to be out front, the desire to lead the parade, the desire to be the first, to be first, right?
Mhm.
And then he pivots in that text, to say, call me, if you want to, if I'm gonna be what do you say? If I'm gonna be
Call me a drum major for the justice.
justice, right,
Yeah.
right,
Call
right,
me a
right, right.
drum major for peace.
That's
Call
right.
me a drum major for righteousness. Yes,
That's right.
yeah.
That's right. That's right. And then he closes as a good Baptist preacher gonna close. If I could help somebody, right?
Yeah.
As I travel on, if I could help somebody with a word or something, then my living, or I can. Now I'm feeling my help a little bit. I feel like I might want to preach. So right. It is. Yeah. I appreciate your words, Doc. And it right there that maybe the role of the prophet in part today is to remind the folk who are listening, the folk who, and maybe, sometimes you out there and you just, you like Nehemiah. Is somebody going to help me build this wall? Is somebody going to help me rebuild what has been destroyed, the ruins that have been, our city, our town, our living, our existence, after the catastrophe comes. There's always the remnant that then comes back to say, hey, there's something of value here that we can take from the ashes, take from the ruins, and to build again afresh, anew. And I think maybe we are in this moment. We've had to, catastrophe occurred during COVID. And none of us can say we were untouched by the losses, the significant losses, the way in which we've had to rebuild rebuild and sometimes build new systems, new structures, new
Mhm.
ways of being. It's not unheard of now to have a mask on. And I remember giggling at those who were from other places in the world who
Yep.
walked around with masks. I remember the moment. Now I
Yep.
don't giggle no more. Uh, you know, it is for me. It's just that close. It's not talking about something in the 1800s. You and I, we get very, very down in the weeds of that for some of us. But for me, I won't get in the weeds of you ain't no weeds. You can go. You remember, right? I'll end here. I used to teach a class, and I used to ask them in the class, what are your moments? What are the significant moments of your journey? This was early in the class. We're getting to know one another, and during that period of time, almost to the one, people would say 9/11. Of course, I was
Mhm.
teaching to a group of people that 9/11 would have been a significant moment. There were, and I think back to the one particular class. There was one student who was my age. In fact, they were older than me, and she was able to say, "Well, you all call 9/11 your moment, but I remember November 1963."
Mhm.
uh, or for me, I remember very clearly and distinctly April 4th, 1968.
Mhm.
It felt like the whole world had shifted and changed. And there are these other dates. Of course, in 1963, JFK was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Of course, April 4th, 1968, Dr. King his life ended to an assassin's bullet. So these moments, these dates, these significant times when something happened and we look back on it and that life changed.
Mhm.
From there, there's pre Dr. King's assassination for me, and post Dr. King's assassination for me, right? Those are significant moments. It is when we have these moments we are called to. The prophet is called, is summoned to take the mantle on, maybe, and then to speak and act in ways that cause the community to come together to maybe heal a bit, and maybe do the work of community building afresh and anew, right? Right? Right.
Mhm.
Is there any other last word, brother, as we conclude? We've been on for an hour, and I told you I'll just hold you for an hour, and I already done went past that time. But is
Well,
there any?
I think the last thing I want to say is that the prophet's vocation across all of our sacred texts, the prophet's vocation at the end of the day has been to remind the people um, that God is faithful even when you are not. And it is because of that that you can have hope.
Well, brother, the Reverend Doctor Stephen Ray, thank you very much, sir. I appreciate you very much. And love to you and your family, your sweetheart, and our sister. And I appreciate very much the work that you are now doing in New Haven with our sisters and brothers there. They're not unknown to me, and so we greet them and greet you and salute you as you continue to do the work of ministry in the particular vineyards that God has allowed for you and I to serve and witness in. It is a joy to call you brother and friend and family in the work, and
Indeed,
appreciate
my friend. Indeed.
you for coming and being with us. And this won't be the last time. We got some more conversations on this as we lead as we continue on to what happens this fall and beyond. All right. God
Mhm.
bless everybody. Thank you all for watching and listening. I appreciate you, and we'll be back at it. As they said back in the '60s, same bat channel, same bat time.
Mhm.
We'll be back at you again. All right. God bless everybody. Peace. We'll talk to you.